Cruise ship workers at Reddit. What was the biggest OID moment on the boat that luckily passengers didn't find out about at all? I'm working on a cruise ship currently. One time we had to turn around to take someone to a hospital, and then there was a fire in the laundry room, and it was also pretty rocky seas. Also, people die on cruise ships, and the bodies are kept in a special freezer. I mean, you gotta do something with the body if you're at sea. Edit. While this blew up. Testicles. That is all. Ship just arrived in Whittier, Alaska, the port for anchorage, and an elderly passenger dropped dead while walking down the gangway. A conflict ensues between the port security and the ship's medical team. The port security didn't want the ship's medical team to get involved because it technically happened off the ship and the local authorities had jurisdiction. There really was no saving the guy, but the ship's medical team at least wanted to try, but the local authorities wouldn't even allow the chief medical officer to start CPR. The coroner had a 6-hour eater, so the port authorities bagged up the body and stuffed it in an X-ray machine storage container in port, guarded by local police, until the coroner could arrive to take the body to Anchorage. The wife of the deceased continued on to finish the vacation for the 7-day rail trip to Denali. It was a 14-day gimmick. 7 days at sea. 7-day scenic rail trip. My understanding was the cruise line calmed her entire vacation, arranged for the remains to be returned home at no cost to her, and provided a personal escort assistant for the remainder of her vacation. We were sailing from Hawaii to San Francisco to dry dock and make repairs to our ship, when a propeller crapped out a day and a half into what should have only been 7 days at sea, so it added a day and a half to the voyage. People were panicking. Everyone thought we were going to run out of food, until the captain reminded everyone we had enough food for a month at sea, and if it was any longer, some perishables might spoil, but they could fly in supplies in an emergency if needed. We arrived in San Francisco with no more delays. Anticlimactic, I know. On a side note, watching a giant cruise ship getting lifted out of the water to dry dock is surreal as hell. Also, sailing under the Golden Gate Bridge and looking up from the 13th deck was super surreal. I was hoping the whole time we were going to clear it. It was probably only about 50 feet above my head. Water pipe burst in a storeroom and soaked all of the spare toilet paper. This was on day 2 of a 14-day voyage to Antarctica. The cabin stewards had to swap around rolls of paper between low-use and high-use guest cabins, and it came right down the wire. None of the guests found out or realized. Now toilet paper is hidden in every cabin instead of a centralized location. I was playing a production show. Guitar was standing on stage with a wireless unit alone to play Purple Rain. And then all of a sudden the house lights came on and the curtains closed. Everyone in the audience looked at me, and I ran off the stage. Turns out a sewage pipe burst backstage and there was it everywhere. Show was cancelled and the passengers didn't find out why. Well, all the passengers found out, but on a QM2 transatlantic crossing, one of the kitchen staff got drunk one night and hurled himself overboard in the North Atlantic. The ship basically found out the next morning when the first mate kept calling on the ship-wide intercom for him to go to his post. That afternoon, the captain announced what happened and that the ship was turning around to, with the help of 3 nearby merchant ships, try to search for him. Of course it was foggy as hell and you couldn't see 100 yards, but just about everyone was on the railings with binoculars trying to search for the poor guy. A wedding even stopped on board. The whole party out looking once the announcement came that we were in the search area. After, shockingly, nothing was found. The concierge desk set up a multinational currency donation box to send to his family back in Chile. There were 4 days left in the trip at that point, and every day that box was stuffed to capacity. I hope it helped them. I work on cargo ships, but I've trained with cruise ship workers, so I've heard a few stories. I read your comment below, and generally the news only picks up on accidents on ships if it's a major accident involving a lot of people. So pretty much only cruise ships, and luckily besides the Costa Concordia it's pretty rare these days. I do know that they have codes when speaking about incidents though, so to not alarm passengers. For example, if someone is hurt dead, quite common. If you have a heart attack at sea, then your chances suck, and they need to call for help via tannoy. They will use a code so the passengers don't know what they are talking about. Also, as someone else mentioned, Certain cruise companies that attract older passengers have a separate fridge for bodies because getting through a trip without a death is not so common. I used to be a crew member, and one time a guy working at the front desk jumped overboard after a crew party. He was found a few hours later by the Coast Guard, and everybody was asked to be discreet in order to keep the cruise running smooth. And everything was fine until the captain came on the PA and said we were delayed because a crew member jumped overboard. Then the madness begins. Rumors appear out of nowhere, and the rest of the cruise was pretty much guests asking what happened the whole time. A lot of it happens on board. I could write a book, maybe even more than one. Another time a guy committed suicide in his cabin, and his family was on board, including a little girl, but this time it didn't leak to the guests. I saw the family as they were being escorted to the security office. Felt so bad for them. A friend of mine got fired for jetting wasted. Got pissed and starting peeing all over his cabin while the security guys were there to take care of him. He spent the night in the little jail on board before being dumped the next day in whatever port we were. Also, every time we had ice cream at the crew restaurant, people would say it was because they had to empty the freezer to put a dead body. I went on a cruise once. There was an infestation of lice and I got off at the first port and flew home. Carnival fully reimbursed me. One time I was on a cruise, and a few cabins down a man and woman who were cheating on their wife and husband, respectively, got super drunk and fell over the edge of their balcony from really high up. It was at night too. The whole cruise ship stopped once it was reported and it took like an entire day to search for them. Apparently the man had his jeans or something because he had inflated them somehow and they were floating holding them. They reported that they were stung by multiple jellyfish and were super cold the whole time. That must have been the scariest, most terrible 18 hours of their lives. Probably not going to get a lot of answers. I know at least Carnival makes their employees pay for internet. I was talking with some crew and they were asking about current events and politics because they are almost cut off because of how expensive the internet access is. Not a crewman, nor am I a bosun, but I went on one of those overnight cruises to Bruges and we caught one of the seamen with his pants literally around his ankles as he was balls deep in one of the waitresses. We skiddled the heckaroo out of there and later found that it was actually a couple who were on the cruise as passengers and were role playing. That we had actually barged into their cabin by accident while drunk. Can confirm everything here so far. Dead people, missing persons, suicides, crew and passengers busted drug muling, wild crew parties with 60-cent beers and $1 pack of smokes, so much sugar, grapsics, etc. Breaking the crew packs, mingling rules all the time, fires, man overboards, medical emergencies, helipad avocs. They use codes. Oscar equals man overboard. Bravo fire. Star code equals medical emergency. Equipment fails where you drift for an extra day or two. Sometimes blamed on ports or weather, other times they are honest. Storms and rough seas. Bath bags everywhere and bouncing off walls. Boat drills. Crew and passengers. Twice per week. Hell, so many. I'll try and think of more. AMA if you want. Source, see username. Did 5 years in shipboard casinos with Celebrity Royal Caribbean. Someone died. My dad has been working on cruise ships for 30 plus years and on one specific cruise we were on in 2008 a man who used to be a sailor all his life took his life. He wanted to die at sea. Stopped taking his meds. Had a small heart attack in the cafeteria but was okay. Then that night he spent the whole night dancing with his family who he brought on a cruise and he died the next morning. Had to be kept in the freezers until the next stop in Greece where his family got off and went back to Hungary. All the other passengers were informed that he went home due to his health issue because it was a very public thing but it was for his funeral. They still come back to the ship every year. Also they lost the anchor once. I contacted my dad for the video and details and will update soon. Update. Seems like I'm a disappointment for more than my parents. Dad can't contact me yet but I did some digging and I believe the ship wasn't the one he was on. Let me explain. My mom showed me this video that my dad sent. Due to the remarks I believed it was Greek workers, therefore my dad's line and communication was weird when he was near Norway, so I believed it happened on the ship he was on. I really apologize for the misunderstanding. It was years ago and a head injury occurred in between. In the video, by the way, the machinery snaps where the brakes are. Again. Sorry. No. The house band doesn't care if you are the second coming of Eric Clapton. We aren't going to invite you on stage to hear your version of Sugar. Just relax and enjoy yourself. Yes, we sometimes have bad nights. Playing 3-4 hour sets 5 nights a week for months on end does leave some room for us to not be on our A game sometimes. Just relax and enjoy the show. Welp, looks like we need to cut the set short tonight. Kids, the drummer just had a heart attack. Be sure to tip the waitress. The DJ will be right up to keep the music going. My buddy is right next to me. We work on boats together, but he used to work on a cruise ship. This is what he says. I have plenty of OIT moments, but I'll give you my biggest OIT moment. So we were stuck in the locks of Amsterdam for over 4 hours and no indication of what's going on. After a few HRS had passed, the captain came on the PA system, and the reason we didn't leave was because there was a live mine from World War II 1 kilometer from the front of the ship. Sorry, I'm on mobile and had to condense the dialogue. A new guy miscalculated the pool treatment and one of the jacuzzis ended up with a pH less than 2. It was discovered before the area opened, and that one remained netted for the rest of the day while it was balanced. A wiper painter stood on a small cupronickel black water pipe to reach higher on the bulkhead. Literal OIT moment. From the floor to his knees. If you're pushing 140 revs on the shaft and the ship still won't break 15 knots. Check the bulbous bow for whales. That a door is a flotation device for two. I currently work for a cruise line on shore. I have assisted people who want to bury their loved ones at sea. Obviously, the bodies have to have been cremated and the ashes have to be in a biodegradable container. My buddy worked in the theater on a cruise ship and always had fun stories from traveling around. Cool thing, beers are less than $1 in the crew bar. Bad thing, you always have to be sober enough to operate a lifeboat and man your station during an emergency. Crew members getting left in countries because they were off getting drunk and chasing cute locals. Old people dying and being put in a freezer on a low deck near one of their storage areas. Good times. I don't know a lot about cruise ships, but I do know that the pools on the Titanic after all these years are still full. My sister worked on one for a few years. People did eventually find out, but they use code words over the PA system for various events that can happen. A guy got into a fight with his family and jumped. The ship circled back and used spotlights from their stage shows to look in the water. They could hear screaming briefly, but the guy was never spotted. These were shark waters as well, so he either drowned or was eaten, or a bit of both. There is video. It isn't really NSFW, but probably worth tagging it anyway. Worked on a ship where the center housed up and died due to contaminated lubricating oil. A friend on the engineering staff said that from the time they noticed the temperature change to complete fuba was less than 10 seconds. Did the company replace it? No. Divers stripped the blades off the prop next turnaround day and they left it that way for the next 6 months. Driddock is expensive. Y'all. Ran the other 2 props at 110% and shortened our port stays to compensate for the reduced speed. Never mind what would have happened if we'd lost another one in the middle of a storm. Brand new ship. 2. Used to leak through the front shell gates when we crossed the Bay of Biscay. I'm sure the guests wouldn't have been happy to see 3 inches of water sloshing back and forth on the luggage deck every cruise. It was actual lit. Stranded on the ocean with our sewage system backed up. Never go on a cruise. Oh yeah. The passengers did find out about that one. A passenger went missing and nobody could find him for a couple days. It turns out he committed suicide in the fan room, so everyone had been sucking dead guy air for a while. We definitely kept that one under wraps. That's the only one that the crew kept secret, but I have some crazy funny stories about working on ships. I was a musician and one time a guest ent. A fly-on act who joins the ship for a cruise to perform one show, thought he was ducking Freddie Mercury and threw out his digipack CDs like ninja stars into a completely dark house. It ended up clocking some old woman a half an inch below the eye and she had to go to medical. The husband wrote the cruise director a very threatening letter basically saying my wife almost went blind, so I strongly suggest you give us a free steak dinner. I would usually be hungover, so I'd drink during the day to get over it. I'd go out in port and get smashed and come back on turnaround days. Days where a new group of passengers arrive. We have to take attendance and do a life jacket demonstration. I was so drunk one time I threw up in the stairwell as passengers were coming in. I somehow didn't get fired or even reprimanded, even though everything I puked up was straight liquid and smelled caustically like booze. We all have small cabins in close proximity to each other. We usually keep a spare key under our nameplates in case we lock ourselves out by accident. One night I woke up to a fellow musician who didn't have a shirt on pissing into my wastebasket in the corner. He was so drunk he thought my cabin was his and he got the key from behind the nameplate and just decided to piss into the closest hole. I haven't worked on a cruise, but I did go on a Disney cruise in February. Obviously we knew this happened, since I can tell the story. As an aside, the cruise was amazing, and even though Disney cruises cost more, ours was entirely done with rewards points. The ship never had lines for anything and the staff was beyond incredible. Anyway, a small electrical fire broke out in a cabin down the hall from us. It's jolting being woken up on a cruise by a general alarm and opening the cabin door to see a crewman sprinting down the hall with a fire extinguisher. The ship's captain quickly walked past as well, with a couple officers flanking him. A few minutes later they had crews stationed throughout the ship's halls, explaining to everyone what had happened and that everything was fine. The family that had been in the cabin got moved elsewhere, and at the next port it seemed like they brought in extra people to clean the floor to remove the smell. It was mild anyway. Fires on ships are scary. The response is always immediate and probably proportionally larger than it needs to be. My father was a firefighter on his cruiser when he was in the Navy, and he had similar stories. Ships don't duck around when it comes to fire. A pipe burst and flooded the kitchens. It was a waste pipe, so we had to throw everything out and get a sanitation company to meet us at our next port and go out and buy all new inventory. We gave out vouchers for food, but if we had been further from port that would have been awful. I have a feeling you're not going to get many answers from actual cruise ship workers. My oh it moment was when I was hired for a ship on 2-day notice. Trombone player. When I got on the ship I found out that I was replacing a guy who had just died in a jet skiing accident in Nicaragua. Everyone in the crew knew it, and the last cruise's passenger knew it, and the entire band that I was joining was obviously traumatized. In the end, it ended up being my favorite contract, but the first few weeks were difficult for everyone. RIP Bone Guy, I never knew you, but I know they all loved you. Heard this one from a friend who worked the cruise ships in the 80s, so it was one of those mainly senior citizen cruises, and an older gentleman passed away while lying on one of the outside sunds. Luckily, one of the officers was first to notice, and quickly called over 2 South American staff members, whose English was less than perfect, and he tells them, "Get rid of that quick before anybody sees it." The officer meanwhile tracks down the gentleman's partner, and after consoling her through her grief, she asks to see the body. He takes her to the refrigerator where they keep people who pass away, and it's empty. He calls the ship's doctor, who knows nothing about any body. Now furious, the officer hunts down the 2 staff members who moved the body. He finally finds them, and goes ballistic. Where the hell is that body? They look at each other, and one of says, "You say get rid, we get rid." The officer is now confused. "What are you talking about?" In answer, the man makes a throwing over the railing motion. In hindsight, I wish I'd asked my friend what they told his wife. Fires. I worked on a cruise ship for 2.5 years and we had 3 major fires. They were all in crew areas and were controlled and extinguished by our awesome fire team. The passengers never knew what happened, only that their waiter had to leave in the middle of dinner service. People don't realize how much training the crew members go through to handle these situations, and they will never know that their waiter just helped save the whole goddamn ship. I worked on a ship almost 15 years ago. Many stories. This happened to a friend of mine. A family came on. They had a teenage son, who was not interested in the cruise. As soon as the family got to their room, he jumped off his balcony, which is insanely dangerous. They fished him out, and the family got kicked off the ship. Another fact. There is a small jail-like area called a brig. On my ship it was on the crew floor, and it had a one-way mirror. Usually it was used for drunk or disruptive passengers. We once had an entertainer find out his ex was coming on the ship. That made him a little stabby, so they put him in the brig until the next port. We were on a family cruise, and after a wonderful dinner we were trying to get back to our room. As we got to our floor and headed down the hallway, there was a new dead end. A wall had appeared that separated us from our room. We were told we had to go the opposite way and go around another hall on the other side of the boat. As we walked we noticed many new walls. Once we got to the other side, the floor was wet and one of the new walls was leaking water from behind it. It took us 20 minutes to navigate the newly built out labyrinth. We were so worried we were taking on water we could barely sleep that night. I was a passenger and was shooting the shit with one of the crew members late at night. He told me that on an earlier cruise someone had died in a hot tub the first night out of port and people didn't know for hours. He managed to stay propped up and his sunglasses helped hide it. Several passengers entered the hot tub during the time and assumed he was antisocial for whatever reason. The crew discovered him when they were closing the pool area for the night. They moved the body downstairs to the morgue. None of the passengers except the guy's family found out about it. One of the waiters had to go to the back room really bad, but it was during the dinner rush, so the supervisor told him to wait. He ended up running out of the restaurant and shitting his pants on the way out and left a trail behind him. Also, not really an OID moment, but the amount of workers who get pregnant is pretty crazy. So much ducking goes on between the crew, it's crazy. I want to preface this by saying I never confirmed this myself, but was general consensus by most of the crew. Used to work on cruise ships. Generally we leave ports of call around 4 or 5. Never really staying later than that due to port regulations. One night, we had a surprise late night at a port. All the passengers and most of the crew had a wonderful time. It was a port of call with a very active nightlife. I was part of the last groups coming back to the ship and noticed a few men in scuba suits entering and leaving the water. Large machinery in the water off the stern of the ship sporadically lighting up, almost like someone was welding underwater. A few days later I was in the mess hall and heard that the ship underwent heavy maintenance to repair an area taking on water. Hubs and I went on the Oriana to the top of Norway for our honeymoon this February-March. Thoroughly recommended. But when we were in outer some 70 north, it was -15 during the day and got down to -27 both nights we were there. Pretty cold. In fact so cold that the poor old girl had her pipes freeze. The electrics go out. They were cooking lunch in the dark using guys with torches. Captain Gray even said later that he checked Oriana's logs and she'd never endured colder than -10 in outer before then. Then worse as we were heading back south and hit the North Atlantic current, which was -6 and so melted all those frozen pipes. Some flights of stairs and a little mini buffet were closed because of water damage, and they did say on disembarkation, if you're a plumber, please stay. My housemate's sister works for Carnival and mentioned to me they'd had an emergency meeting about Oriana's predicament. Currently working on a ship sailing out of Nick. Just a few months ago we had a passenger go through a breakup with his girlfriend over the phone while on board. He went to his mother's cabin, told her goodbye, and before anyone could do anything about it he ran up to deck 15 and jumped about 150 feet into the water. The rescue boats searched for hours and never recovered the body. Everyone assumed he got sucked under the ship and into the propulsion system. Protocol is not to tell other passengers more than they need to know in the event of an emergency, so we all had to keep quiet. Also on decks TT-1 through 2 there are a bunch of watertight doors that divide up the different compartments that have several tons of force behind them when closing. They will stop at pretty much nothing when set to close. We once had a contracted mechanic on board doing some temporary work and he dropped a tool on the wrong side of a closing watertight door. He reached back to grab it and his arm proceeded to get stuck and the door closed on his shoulder. Totally sliced off his arm and he bled out and died before someone found him. Only one I have witnessed were 2 fires in the engine rooms. Scary thought. Because of the nature of the ship's normal workers are picked to be firefighter trained. So your on-board firefighters will be engineers or wait staff or galley men. They chose the big bulky ones who won't be blown over when the water comes out the hose. I was IT officer on board, now senior, on my, I think, third contract or so we had a complete meltdown of our data center. Everything stopped working. PMS, hotel management system, POS, point of sales, of course all the file shares, email etc. It took us 3 days and a lot of luck, and I am talking really a big chunk of luck, to get everything up and running again. Our front of the house staff handled the situation amazingly. Everyone who usually relies on emails from external came afterwards to thank us for the downtime and asked if we couldn't do that more often. Sure. Our guests didn't notice a thing that basically the whole operation needed for the hotel side of our ship was affected and every system was down. This didn't affect any bridge or engine equipment, as it is completely separated from our environment that we in IT are handling. My dad worked on a cruise liner in the 80s. When it was in the Falklands as a troop carrier it was nearly sunk by a French Exocet missile fired by the Argentinians. I believe it was closer than 100 meters before it was destroyed. Another time one of the engineers discovered a fire in the engine room, and so as not to cause too much of a panic by sounding the alarm he ran around the middeck shouting Ossify in the main engine room and then ran back downstairs. Finally another fire was once discovered by a boiler technician who, whilst not on duty and drunk, put it out with his makeshift male firefighting equipment. My in-laws went on a cruise and someone killed themselves by jumping off the damn ship in an empty area. They found out like hours later and had to go back looking for him. Never found the body. Everyone knew though. I don't work on a cruise ship but on a ro-ro ship that can take a few passengers. We got complaints one day of the toilets in one of the passenger cabins not flushing. After the engineers spent hours flushing out the sewage system to get into the right pipes, turned out the only couple on board had been dumping all their condoms down the toilet which had clogged the whole system. Finally something I can comment on. I work as a contractor on cruise ships and jump between ships all throughout the year. I've done 18 cruises in the last year and being a contractor I get a lot of interaction with guests and crew. The crew is trained in virtually every possible situation you can imagine and have required drills every week. There is quite a bit of death on board and there is a morgue on most ships I work on. A lot of suicides that nobody catches until someone reports them missing and you hear they jumped in the middle of the night. In fact I've been on board when they had more deaths than they had room for, so they threw a surprise ice cream party for the crew so they could make room in a separate freezer. But what actually was the craziest experience for me on board was when we lost satellite the night of the last election, and when everyone woke up we got it back and the results were just in. I've never seen a more divided ship amongst guests, arguments, parties, fistfights. It was 8 AM. where we were at the time, and it's definitely a weird way to start a day at sea. We also had a guest get stuck on a mountain in Alaska and we had to call in air support before we could leave to get them back. And my favorite story to tell is when I was saying the Red Sea we had armed security on board and they just stood and watched the water in case of pirates. We had required lights out and curtains closed after 6 PM for our own protection, and it was always fun to see a tiny army ready to fight pirates at any given moment. Those dudes could drink.